All right, let's talk about Rings of Power Season 2. So this season, it's kind of hard to believe because it feels like we had only just recently watched the pilot. And I suppose that because they had released the first 3 episodes at once, it was a shorter time ago. They did 1 through 3, and then 4, 5, 6, and 7. So it's only really been 5 weeks, I suppose. But it's flown by. The season is over next week, and I'm sure that the finale... We'll have a lot to talk about when the finale comes around, but this is going to be a full spoiler discussion for episode 7 of the Rings of Power. If you have not seen episode 7, just make sure to save the video for later, save the podcast for later, save the segment for later, watch episode 7, and then come back and we can have a discussion about it after that point. So this is your final warning. We are going to be going into full spoilers about episode 7 of the Rings of Power. Now, before I do that, I wanted to address something really quickly. I want to make this very brief because I want to spend the entire time talking about Rings of Power Episode 7, and there's so much to talk about here. But before I do that, I've noticed in the past few weeks that there has been a lot of discussion in the comment section with these Rings of Power segments, and that's totally great because one of the main reasons I do this is to have discussions with you guys in the comments down below, and that absolutely, 100%, 1000%, includes disagreements. It is just my opinion. I am not here to tell you should like or dislike anything. I am here to tell you why I personally like or I personally dislike certain things, certain episodes, certain movies, certain shows. And then I'd love to talk about it with you guys in the comments. And if you guys disagree, I'd love to hear it, so long as you are, explaining why and letting me know, oh, it's because, I'm a big Tolkien fan and this didn't land for me, etc., etc. A couple things to remember, though, always when we talk about these kinds of shows is that it's all about fun and it's all about enjoyment. And not to say that you have to like every single thing you watch or every single thing you read or every single, art is not like that. We are all different people coming from different backgrounds. And so we are not all going to like the same things. That's totally fine. But this channel is built on positivity and generally, good, hearty discussion and respect, right? That's what this channel is built on. So please, I welcome your disagreements, and you guys should welcome each other's disagreements in the comments down below. But the second it starts turning into negativity and insults and berating and belittling and things of that nature, that's when I draw the line. So it hasn't happened a lot, but I've just been noticing because, a lot of people who comment on the videos don't seem to like the series. That's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And there have just been a couple comments here and there that have, I think, veered a little bit too far into the direction of where I don't want this community to be. So I just want to be clear. It's not that I don't want disagreement. Again, just tell me your honest thoughts and tell other people your honest thoughts about the show, but do it in such a way that is obviously respectful and respectful of other people's thoughts and opinions that are different from yours. And we're all coming from different places and we're all sharing our different thoughts. So I don't want to go on too much longer because I just want to talk about this episode, and I've been enjoying talking about these episodes thus far, and I just want to make sure that this community is a safe space to talk about that. So if you enjoyed the episode, comment down below. If you didn't enjoy the episode, comment down below. I'd also just really quickly before we move on want to say that if you're not enjoying the show, and if you're hating the show, honestly, it kind of baffles me to see so many people hating this show and continuing to watch it. I understand, a couple people have explained their reasonings for me, why they're continuing to watch the show even though they dislike it. That's totally fine. Totally fine. I just think for the vast majority of people who, continue to just complain about the show and to the extent that this is the worst thing I've ever seen and et cetera, there is nothing, absolutely nothing binding you and gluing you to the TV screen or the, whatever computer screen or wherever you're watching the Rings of Power. At this point, it's been 7 episodes. That's 7 hours of your life, And I would just encourage that if there are things you would enjoy watching more, even rewatching something you would enjoy more, I would hope that you could find enjoyment in things, because I think that's what it's all about. Life is about finding enjoyment in art. A big part of it is, at least, especially for people like us in this community, and I'd hope that would be the case for you. So that is my spiel. I'm going to stop talking about all that stuff now, and I hope that we can just enjoy this discussion in the comments below as we talk about this episode. But Rings of Power Episode 7, spoiler discussion. And, part of the reason I bring this up is because I have a very strong opinion about this episode. And so I want to preface this by saying, again, this is just my opinion and absolutely not trying to persuade you of anything, just want to explain how I feel. But that being said, I think this episode is nearly flawless. I know that a lot of people are going to disagree with me. That's totally fine. I think this episode has one, I'm not going to say little thing, because it happens and it's a big thing. And I disliked when it happened. But this episode in its totality, it's almost an hour long, had one thing that lasted 20 seconds that I didn't like. And the rest of the episode, I was floored by this episode. And I keep saying, I feel like I'm tempted to keep saying, what was it, episode 5? This is the best one yet. Episode 1 was the best one yet when it came out, and I think episode 5 was the best one when it came out. Episode 6 was good, really, really good, just continuing to build that momentum. But I can't say that this isn't the best episode yet. This has to be the best episode yet, which makes me think, am I just going to keep saying this with episode 8 coming out, the finale? Because I was so incredibly impressed with this episode. And if every single episode was like this, was of this caliber, this would have been on par with some of the greater shows that I've seen over the last couple of years. All that being said, for those of you who have been following along with my spoiler discussions of The Rings of Power, you'll know that I didn't love episodes 2 and 3, and I really didn't like episode 4. So the show, for the most part, has not maintained that consistency. But, if you take the start that it had in episode 1, and then you start to feel that momentum building with episode 5, 6, 7, and now we're going into 8, I can't believe this is the same team that made season 1, because it is a night and day difference. So as always, I wrote some notes down. We're going to go through them here in through the episode, and then we will be talking about my overall thoughts again at the very end. So we pick up here with Kell, and I have to say the actor who's playing Kell, and I can't remember his name off the top of my head, unfortunately, but the actor who's playing him, I realized this just as this episode was beginning, and I wasn't even, thinking, I was thinking about this at the beginning, because by the end of the episode, even more so, I was thinking this. But we've gone this entire season, I think, without giving Kell his due. And the actor who's playing him deserves a lot more praise than I think we've been giving him, because the actor has had to do a lot of heavy lifting in the series, and he's done a really good job. I believe his determination in forging the rings. I believe his guilt later on. I believe his struggle, with temptation. And I think that I think that this actor has quietly had to do a lot of the heavy lifting in this show, especially, opposite Charlie Vickers, who plays Sauron, and what a menacing, crazy presence he is. I think Sauron, he's giving a lot of villains recently in sci-fi, fantasy, comic book, pop culture, you name it. He's giving a lot of these villains a run for their money. He's been amazing. And his manipulation and illusions, the mouse, we'll get to the mouse a little bit later, but seeing the mouse earlier, and then later on Kell realizes what's going on. It is just so sinister and so heartbreaking to watch a man suffer in this way. I was wondering at the beginning of the episode, as we're watching Kell forge the 9 rings for men, how his workshop hadn't been destroyed, and then I think we get a better picture of that later on. So, as I write these notes, I write down questions that I have, and then as I'm talking through them in the rewatch, or the recap and the rewatch spoiler discussion, I find myself realizing that there were answers to these questions. A lot of them were very intentionally placed as foreshadowing. Speaking of Sauron, he continues to be such an interesting character. So he goes and talks to Kell, and he goes outside and he says, "Yep, Kell is losing his mind," and that's incredibly devious. As always, it's incredibly devious, and he this seed that's planted is something that pays off a little bit later with one of the most horrific moments in television that I've seen in a long, long time. So there is that. We also get to see a little bit of Arondir. He's just hanging around and ready to enter the battle. And I actually, before he died, seemingly, I thought that what they were doing with this character was actually quite interesting. And then he met his end. I'm jumping around a little bit here, but let's keep going chronologically. One of the great things that we did get to see in this episode is Elrond and Durin. One of the things that I enjoyed a lot about episode 1, season 1 of The Rings of Power, was the dynamic between Elrond and Durin. And I know that a lot of people didn't like season 1. I was one of them. I thought that it was pretty boring and it was pretty bland, but I think the dynamic between Elrond and Durin was one of those things that I enjoyed the most. It was wonderful to see those two characters together, and I didn't think I'd be this excited to see them together again, but there they were, and it was great. And how heartbreaking was it, especially after seeing what happens at the end of this episode with Elrond calling after Durin. How heartbreaking was that to see? So again, a lot of really good pieces of foreshadowing here, I suppose. This episode it's focused, right? It has that same level of focus that the previous 2 episodes and episode 1 had. And I love that. The stakes are so clear. There's a battle raging on between, there's orcs and elves, and the stakes here are really clear. Anyways, back in Eregion, we have the scene where Celebrimbor realizes what's going on. I love this because the way that he realizes is with the mouse. I don't know if Sauron missed this or what, because it feels like an obvious thing he could have taken out of his illusion, but the fact that the mouse is making loops and the candles, the wax is not going down, and Celebrimbor realizes he's been in a prison this entire time. And that's just, what a haunting scene when he realizes that he's been trapped. And once the illusion fades away, just seeing his face disheveled and him going outside and watching Eregion burn. It's crazy. And just on top of that, I had many of these moments in this episode where I said something out loud. I was like, oh my goodness, oh my, those kinds of moments. And this was one of them where he tips over the vial of mithril. We think it's mithril, and it's Sauron's blood. And that's just terrifying. That's one of maybe 5 moments I have highlighted here where I really just sat back in my chair and my mouth was wide open. My jaw was on the floor. It was terrifying. I want to say, and you can go back on tape and listen to this, that I have, and that, by the way, I always say this, that's the great thing about having a YouTube channel, is that if you make predictions and they happen to be right, and I don't know if this one's right yet, but I think we're getting to the point where it is, then it's on record. But I think that what I said earlier was one of the reasons that I think the 9 rings are different is because they are infused, they're built differently, which is why I believe, at least, that when you have these 9 rings that are worn, that they turn the men into Nazgul. I don't know this. I haven't, read this in canon or anything like that. It was just a theory that I had because the Black Riders, obviously, in Lord of the Rings were a pretty big deal. And so that was my theory. And now I'm pretty sure this is a validation of that theory, that these rings were forged a little bit differently than the Elven and the Dwarvish rings. So there is that. To add insult to injury, meanwhile, Mirandia, who is the female elf who has taken a liking to Sauron, to her own detriment, unfortunately, later on. But she has been so deceived that when Celebrimbor, finally escapes, that she just doesn't believe him. She thinks he's crazy. And that is the deception of Sauron. That is incredibly, incredibly, incredibly deceiving and devious. And then the second of many just, oh my goodness, moments is when she dies, Sauron flicks her off the tower and basically makes it look like Celebrimbor did it. And it's just, I was so shocked in that moment. I couldn't believe what had just happened. It was, what a crazy moment to have that. And I think the show, I don't know, I respect it for having the guts to do something like that, where it's just constantly keeping you on your toes. Because look, there are scenes later on where Elrond's life is in danger or Galadriel's life is in danger, and part of me goes, oh man, that's a bummer. Not because I want these characters to die, but because every time they get into a situation where something dangerous is about to happen to them, you just don't, I don't feel it, because I'm like, these characters are fine. They're fine. If they kill Elrond, if they stab Elrond, it's actually going to make me even more confused, because I'm going to be like, well, then this is a fake death, and that's lame, So yeah, I definitely, I think that it just keeps you on your toes when you have these characters who you don't know what's going to happen to them in the immediate future. Mm-hmm. Elrond enters the scene, speaking of Elrond, and it's not quite for Frodo, in Return of the King, but it's pretty cool to see him riding up there. And another really slick move here. This was another, not jaw-dropping moment per se, but this was a moment where I really applauded the show because it wasn't what I was expecting. They brought out the cage where Galadriel was, and all of a sudden, Elrond's army stops, and instead of a huge battle playing out, which, we did get a huge battle later on in the episode, so it's not like we just didn't get anything at all. But instead of that, we were diverted a little bit to a diplomacy, quote unquote diplomacy, negotiation scene, I should say. And I think that's a really clever way of playing that scene where you think that it's going to be this huge battle and it's going to be, orcs and elves, but it's actually pivoting to this scene where Elrond and Elrond has to kind of bargain for his life because he has one of the rings, the Elvish rings. And look, I mean, Adar, I think Adar has a point, right? His point is that Erakion has fallen under the hands of Sauron already, and so, why protect the city? But then you get the other hand, on the other hand, the point that Elrond is making that, no, this is an Elvish city and we need to protect it. And so I think that both points of view here, surprisingly enough, are actually quite interesting to hear that. So yeah, it's a sad scene, because a lot of things are on the line here. He says, Galadriel's life for the One Ring. Now, we're going to take a break from all of my gushing about this episode, because like I said, I think this episode is almost flawless. I just could not believe how amazed I was by this episode. We're going to take a quick break, though, and talk about the one thing I did not like in this episode. You probably, if you had heard me say this at the beginning of this segment, you probably knew what it was. It was the kiss between Galadriel and Elrond. I get it in terms of the plot, whatever, that he was trying to give her the thing that she used to escape or whatever. That's fine. There were so many other ways that could have been done, and I just don't think that was warranted. It felt very, I don't know, I got instant flashbacks to the theater in 2019 when I watched Rise of Skywalker and saw Ben Solo and Rey kiss for the first time at the very end of the movie. It just didn't feel right somehow, and I'm just really not a big fan of this. So if they go anywhere with this subplot in in season 3 or whatever, I personally would not be a big fan. So I hope that this was just a one-off kind of thing, and then we can move on, because this was the one thing I did not like about this episode. So anyways, there is that. All right, let's move on. Let's get back to all the things that I really did enjoy. Now we do get the battle, and the battle it's brutal. I mean, we have Elrond flinging an orc with the catapult against the wall. It's just, oh my goodness, it's crazy what's going on here. A lot of really, really just, I don't know. I don't want to say incredible visuals, but visuals that are very inventive for sure. Actually, as I'm looking at my notes, I suppose there's one other thing that I didn't love, although this isn't, I won't put it at the same level of the Elrond Galadriel kiss, but this was just something silly. I think that the fact that Galadriel is now escaping the orc camp, and then she's wearing a hood, and I mean, eventually they recognize her, but she gets away with it for a long time. That just felt a little bit silly, but that's such a nitpick in comparison to all the things I loved about this episode that I just I didn't really care, honestly, at that point. So anyways, Galadriel escapes with the help of Arondir, who finally, what I wrote in my notes here is finally Arondir is joining the main storyline. I was really happy for him. I didn't love, the actor's performance necessarily, but I also think he was just not put in the right situations. And who even knows what happened to Theo and Isildur? Because obviously we need to go back to Isildur eventually, because Isildur is very important to the story of the One Ring. So it's not like we're ditching that storyline entirely, but I mean, this episode just cut out, once again, just like episode 5, cut out every single storyline that I had no interest in. I think the Gandalf storyline, it needs to get somewhere for me to be interested. I'm not disinterested, but I'm not enjoying it because it needs to get somewhere. But the Harfoot storyline, just miserable to me. I just can't stand it. The Theo Isildur storyline right now, miserable. Just can't really stand it. So, just by the fact that they're getting rid of these storylines and just being like, no, it's just Arondir for now, and we'll go with that. I don't know. Respect. I'm sure we'll get back to those storylines next episode, and I'm not going to be happy about it at that point. But I'm hoping it's more like an episode 6 situation where we did get back to those storylines, and yet there were so many other positive things in episode 6 that I enjoyed that overshadowed and overpowered all those things. So I think that is really, really cool. We get a scene here where Sauron is not manipulating, he's just basically enslaving Celebrimbor to work on these, he's shackled him to work on these rings, and he talks about how he himself was, I think, enslaved and tortured by Morgoth, and we get a little bit of a backstory here, which I think is interesting. I wonder if they're going to be building in some, not pity or perhaps sympathy in a sense towards Sauron. Not even sure if that's needed for a character like that. It's just he's crazy wicked and has done all these sorts of things to make himself a captivating character, but we'll see. A line here that I really liked from Celebrimbor as he's making these 9 rings is that you truly are the great deceiver. You can deceive even yourself, which I think hit home a little bit for Sauron. I think that's really, really interesting. Celebrimbor throwing them into the fire. That shot kind of Mount Doom-esque, right? A little bit of a throwback here. I think that's interesting. And then he cuts off his finger. And I hate these scenes. There are so many of these kinds of scenes where characters have to flee handcuffs and wriggle their way or cut something off. And I hate it. I can't stand it. One of the things about me is that I generally don't mind blood or violence or in action scenes and things like that. Generally, obviously I have a limit. Everyone has a limit in that regard. But I just cannot stand quote-unquote medical, is it violence or wounds or gore or things like that, like surgically removing things. There's a scene, this is such an aside, such a tangent, but just to paint a picture of why I dislike this scene so much, not disliked, but was so uncomfortable by this scene. Stranger Things, right, is there are a couple pretty gruesome things that happen in that show. It's not super, super gory or anything, but it's definitely horror adjacent for sure. But the one scene I have to cover my eyes for every single time, I just cannot watch it, is the scene in the finale of season 3 where Eleven has to take out the parasite from her leg. To this day, I have not seen it because the second that scene started for the first time, I could not watch it. So anyways, that's a huge aside. This scene reminded me of all those scenes, and I couldn't. It was terrible. And then Celebrimbor finds Galadriel, and he decides to stay in Eregion and hand off the 9 rings to Galadriel. So we'll see what happens there. Another fantastic line here is when Celebrimbor says, "It is not strength that overcomes darkness, but light." And then he goes on this little mini monologue about that. And I thought that was beautiful. I really did. I know I've said in previous recaps that previous spoiler discussions that some of the writing is pretty bad, but for the most part, each episode has a few really big, nuggets of gold in there. And I love that. I love finding these lines that just stick out to me and make me think a little bit. So yeah. And then we're really, knee deep into this final battle in this episode. I'm sure there'll be more of a battle in the next episode as well. And it's not Helm's Deep. It's not Return of the King, but it's really good. And I was just finding myself enjoying it so much. And then, we have Sauron as he is destroying everything. And that final scene was, it was another one of those moments that my jaw was on the floor when Sauron did what he did to those elvish guards. And it was, I just could not believe it. He's on another level of terrifying right now. And I can't believe how captivated I am by this character and by this show. As the episode wraps up, Gil-galad shows up, which is cool, the Elven King. And it looks like all hope is lost because Elrond, he's looking for Durin, who is trying to summon the army, but then his father is turning on his own, turning on the dwarves, which is crazy. It's a lot of crazy things going on here, but they all make sense in terms of the story. And Arondir, he dies, which is crazy because I also thought his storyline, I should say, his inclusion into the main storyline was something that had a lot of potential. But I also understand the gravity of the situation of having a character like that die in this episode. And, he might come back, but I looked like he was dead in this episode. And then finally, the last jaw-dropping moment here is when Adar gets the ring. This wasn't surprising necessarily. You saw it coming as soon as he walked up to Elrond, but still it's just one of those moments where, oh my goodness, what could happen in the next episode as Adar probably faces off against Sauron with the ring, probably dies. Sauron, I would imagine the 9 rings remain out of his grasp for a little while. And I think one of the really cool parallels too is that the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, he is searching for that one ring, right? And I can totally imagine it here where he's lost these 9 rings and he's searching, he's hunting, and it's sort of in line with Sauron as a character. So guys, I know that a lot of people don't like this show. Totally fine. But I have been loving a lot of the episodes so far. I haven't been a huge fan of a couple of them, for sure. I've mentioned that at the beginning. This episode was on another level. It's this episode 5, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but episode 1 is my 3rd favorite out of the 7 episodes so far, because this episode, and then pretty close behind it, but still distinctly number 2, episode 5. It's just unbelievable what this show can do when it is focused on the things that make this show compelling, which is good writing, Sauron, good characters, crazy, captivating storylines, and all these different plot threads coming together to form a it's just an amazing story that is centered around Sauron and his manipulation and his quest for power. It is unbelievable what they've been able to do in the second season. And I, for one, the season finale, it could disappoint me for sure, but I am so looking forward to it. And if it's on par with even an episode 6, for example, which was, I thought, a really, really good episode with just some things here and there that I didn't really like, I think that I'll have to say this season is, it's like, I don't think it's, I wouldn't call it amazing. I wouldn't call it even super great, but I would call it quite good season of television, just because of the inconsistencies in the beginning of the season. But guys, what did you think about episode 7, season 2 of The Rings of Power? I know that a lot of you guys have been saying you guys don't like the show. Totally fine, but let me know in the comments down below. Let's make sure to keep the discussion respectful, and let's keep the discussion respectful in the comments down below.